When it comes to video games, none hold a candle to the storytelling and strategy demanded of the modern RPG genre. That genre owes a great deal of its existence to the Final Fantasy franchise, and in turn that franchise owes its existence to a company known as Square, gambling on one game designer. That designer is Hironobu Sakaguchi, the man who would become better known to the world as the father of Final Fantasy. His dedication to his dream saw that company and his position within it grow, while his tenacity to see that dream through took the Final Fantasy franchise from a last-ditch effort to save the company to a multi-million-dollar franchise that established the RPG genre as a mainstream source of art and entertainment. His accomplishments in games each furthered the gaming industry and the RPG genre in different ways that should be examined. We'll look into his early efforts to produce the first Final Fantasy, examples of improvements to the franchise over the years, and the events which led to him leaving the company and franchise for good. Now, as with any good story or role-playing game, we should start from the beginning. Though initially a game designer, Hironobu Sakaguchi began his career with the company in 1986 as a game designer. While his initial games proved unsuccessful, he pushed for the opportunity to release a role-playing game after the success of their competitor Enix's game, Dragon Quest, as per Japan's Platinum Game Chart. With the company facing bankruptcy, Sakaguchi was given the go-ahead to create his own RPG for the Famicom to rival Dragon Quest. It was a Hail Mary for Square and for Sakaguchi himself, and often is thought that failure would have meant the end of the company and his video game career. Now, luckily for the designer and the company both, that potential game over was avoided with the first of what would become a long line of Final Fantasy games, finding success with over 500,000 copies sold, as told to Electronic Gaming Monthly in 1994. With the first game offering the happy ending that Square needed, it should not come as a surprise that Sakaguchi was given the go-ahead to work on a sequel, and the franchise was born. Now, any good sequel should introduce something new, something interesting, as the story it's continuing, and almost every Final Fantasy game produced under the guidance of Sakaguchi has done just that. We're going to look at a few important examples of games and advancements that the series has seen under his watchful eye. Now, Final Fantasy III saw the now coveted job system enter the genre, allowing players a much greater range of customization for their parties. This is often seen as the first major evolution of strategy to the genre, and no two player parties need look the same at the end of the game. Now, Final Fantasy IV was the first step onto the newly released Super Famicom system, and used the greater hardware to expand its capabilities across the board. Character personality and histories became a component of the storytelling process, and the first use of a non-permanent party system was introduced. Final Fantasy VI found Sakaguchi not as the director, but the producer and story writer for the game. With over a dozen characters with their own story arcs, personalities, gameplay styles to manage across two worlds, and a plot involving political intrigue and legitimate apocalypse, Final Fantasy VI pushed the Super Famicom to its brink in its memory and performance capabilities. It also introduced to the franchise the idea of desperation attacks, which allow for a last-ditch attempt by a player to save an otherwise unwinnable situation. Now, what Final Fantasy VII did for Square and the genre in general can be an entire essay on its own, but for now just a summary. The game brought the company, or rather the franchise, to the PlayStation on 3 discs, which was the largest on the system at the time. It brought 3D character models, symphony orchestras, environmentalism, emotional scenes that still scar players to this day, and a modern take on a game style that was almost exclusively medieval fantasy based since its inception. Now, Final Fantasy X was the final flagship game that Sakaguchi produced, and it proved one last time that he still had it. The first of the franchise on the PlayStation 2, the classic leveling system was nixed, and updated technologies meant a greater use of cinematography and live music in the game itself. It also was the first Final Fantasy to have a direct sequel, following the story of previously played characters and seeing what happened after the final happily ever after screen. Now, after 17 years of creating Final Fantasy worlds that were always meant to be the last, the day finally came for Hironobu Sakaguchi to see the credits roll on his time with the franchise he had created. A series of events had led to Sakaguchi leaving the company. He was the film director and primary proponent for the critically panned Final Fantasy The Spirits Within movie, which saw Square take a hefty financial loss, as documented by The Vice. This saw Sakaguchi step down as an executive vice president of Square, a position he had earned by his many great feats. He took this opportunity and challenge with the support of Microsoft Games to exit Square and instead create his own gaming company, Mistwalker. Now, though the franchise continues to push the envelope of the RPG genre without the hand and mind of its creator and father, Final Fantasy got to where it was by the hard work and love he had dedicated to it. Now, we have reflected upon the works and achievements of Hironobu Sakaguchi, his early efforts to produce the first Final Fantasy, examples and improvements to the franchise over the years, and the events that led to him leaving the franchise and company behind. Today, the Final Fantasy franchise has reached its 15th iteration. Final Fantasy VII, considered by many as one of Sakaguchi's greatest works, based on its countless accolades and both as a game and as a work of art, has recently had a remake released as the third best-selling game of the year and single best-selling Final Fantasy of all time. We all fantasize about our futures, but Sakaguchi turned his Final Fantasy into a reality.